The first question, Professor Bong, that I'd like to ask you is about an individual. I'd like to ask you about President-elect Yoon Seok-yeol. Who is he? What does he stand for? What do you know about him? So while politics more broadly is taking place in Korea, what about this man that from May will lead the South Korean nation for 5 years? Who is he?
Well, he spent his entire career of 27 years as a prosecutor, and he graduated from, you know, Seoul National University with a major in law. His time was before the law school system was installed. So you can major in law as an undergraduate student in Korean university. So you can say that he's really smart, well educated. His father was a professor at Yonsei University in science. So you could say that he is intelligent enough, educated enough, and having demonstrative track record in career. But you know that he has zero experience or background as a politician. He never served in the parliament or in the administrative branch of the government. So that is a source of concern for many constituents, even those who supported his electoral victory. They argue that people do not really change. So considering that he has spent his entire career as a prosecutor, it doesn't portend well for his presidency because he is likely to behave as a prosecutor, as a top political leader in the office of president. And when I heard that argument, I was sympathetic with that concern. But at the same time, I had a second thought because we can have a different interpretation of the aphorism, popular aphorism that people do not change. Yes, people's track record is the best indicator for the person's future behavior and choices. But at the same time, we should not limit our purview of investigation on the premise that people do not change. If Mr. Yoon Seok-yeol was 100% prosecutor when he was a prosecutor for 27 years, the aphorism that people do not change can have a different meaning and interpretation, I believe. Meaning that he knows his place. He's a person, he's faithful to doing what he's supposed to do. He seems to be a person who knows his place and have a very good understanding and genuine commitment to doing what it must, given the circumstance and given the mandate of his job. So people do not change. Yes, by extending that aphorism that as a president-elect, Yoon Seok-yeol, if he does not change from who he has been for the 27 years and beyond, then he will know very well where he stands, who he is as the president of Republic of Korea. Then it is likely that he will have a very good understanding of what he must do in terms of priority goals for the nation. So I'm open to different interpretations of, the statement that people do not change. It could be a source of concern, but at the same time, it could be reason for constituents to be hopeful.
On this idea of change, Professor Bong, Yoon Seok-yeol, until recently, he was kind of handpicked by President Moon to lead a prosecution. He was involved more with the Democratic Party. So this idea of change, he's now gone to the Conservative Party and won for them, got the victory for them there. What do you make of that? Does that not show some, at least a little bit of political experience? He's been associated with both political parties. He's, spent time with the president. Does that count in his favor? Does that count against him?
Well, I mean, it is subject to different interpretations. If you are supporting his presidency and him as a person or political leader, then him being as such would be a very good sign for him to be a very effective and trustworthy political leader. If you're critical of the presidency of Yoon Seok-yeol, then the track record must be viewed as a very opportunistic and politicized, calculated behavior. I'm inclined to accepting the first interpretation because he gained fame and trust, not only from general public, but also, as you said, that the core members of the ruling party, as well as the current president Moon Jae-in, as a best bet to shore up the fairness and justice in Korea as a person who will lead the prosecutor's office. Because he said that despite all the disadvantages and punishments expected to follow, he declared that he would not, just obey superiority for the sake of obeying or for the sake of keeping his position or interest. That made him very famous figure in Korean politics, despite the fact that he did not participate in politics. He remained in prosecutor's office, and he was appointed to assume the top position in the prosecutor general's office by the current government and by the majority support and endorsement rendered by the members of the ruling party, which lost the presidential election this time. So you cannot blame him being, open to party allegation or party affiliation. It was the Minju Party, the ruling party, who promoted his popularity and public fame and the image as the champion of fairness and justice in the beginning. But once he began to collide with the core members of the ruling party, especially the former, Ministry of Justice and Professor of Law at Seoul National University, Mr. Cho Kuk, then suddenly he got tainted by the ruling party members in the Blue House as opportunistic and anti-justice. So I don't think he owes nothing to prove himself where he stands.
I'm sure many people have different opinions on how to get it, but the idea of fairness and justice in Korean politics and Korean society, I think, is needed. That's what people want. They might agree or disagree whether Yoon Seok-yeol is the person to do it, but I think those values are really important and necessary. You mentioned there are different perspectives on him. One of the critical takes on I see him recently, especially online on social media more than deep political analysis actually, would be that he is Korea's version of President Trump. Do you think there's any justification in that association? Is it sort of a cheap and shallow attack on him, or what do you make of this K-Trump that seems to gain some momentum on social media?
Well, again, it's I'm just stating my own personal opinion, but I'm trying to do in my best and more is to ground my assertion and estimate on verifiable and concrete evidence, whether it's logical or substantive. So by doing so, I'd like to say that, yes, you can compare Mr. Yoon Seok-yeol to Donald Trump, who did not serve in politics prior to the declaration of candidacy in presidential election and actually won it all. In that regard, yes, there's a striking similarity between the case of Mr. Yoon Seok-yeol in South Korea and the case of Donald Trump in the United States. But we also need to consider other elements which highlight differences between the two. There's another, similarity between Donald Trump and Mr. Yoon Seok-yeol, that they came outside the domain of usual party politics which many constituents, if not majority of constituents in the United States and South Korea, were clearly sick and tired of. So they constituents wanted so desperately new fresh air in party politics, and the success of Mr. Yoon Seok-yeol and Mr. Donald Trump would not have become possible without them being able to ride on the tide of thirst, very pervasive and strong among the constituents, voters. But at the same time, what kind of president we can expect from Mr. Yoon Seok-yeol may be quite different from the kind of presidency that American citizens have gotten out of 4 years under the presidency of Donald Trump. As a president, Mr. Donald Trump wasted no time to carry out many of core election platforms and pledges, including building the walls between the United States and Mexico, and scrapping the NAFTA, and enforcing the immigration policy and whatnot. So in that regard, that at least in the eyes of Trumpians, Trump supporters, Trump was the best president ever, because for the first time in so many years, now American citizens had a type of president who actually kept the promises that he made during the campaign, presidential campaign, right? Even after he actually won the presidential election. So he demonstrated his genuine attitude with regards to the promises he had made. We have to wait and see whether Yoon Seok-yeol is going to follow the footsteps of Donald Trump in terms of keeping his promises, the promises he made during the presidential election. The first challenge would be the abrogation of the Ministry of Gender and Family, right?
Yep.
Because it's so controversial during the presidential election and in the immediate afterwards, for right reasons. I think it's such a stupid, wrong-headed, and obtuse idea to divide genders for the sake of winning more popular votes coming from one specific gender. And happily, that strategy turned out to be extremely wrong, right? Yoon Seok-yeol almost lost the election. He only won the election by razor thin margin, only 0.74% of the popular votes, which is smaller because he won the election by 240,000 votes, which is smaller than the votes he won, with which he won the capital city, Seoul. He won more votes, 300,000 votes out of Seoul, the capital city, in this election. But he won the entire election by less margin, smaller votes, 240,000. The main reason for this poor record, despite the fact that he won the election itself, was that he is very obtuse and wrong stance on gender issues, anger female voters. Well, probably for the first time in history of presidential elections in South Korea. So they all came out and vote for the opposite party candidate in Mr. Lee Jae-myung. So if he is going to keep his promise that he's going to enforce legal and other systems to protect young males in Korean society, even at the sacrifice of the fairness and the gender equality, as well as the human rights of female population in Korea to equal protection of law enshrined in Constitution of Korea, then he is going to be like US President Donald Trump in terms of keeping his campaign pledges. But just like Donald Trump was, he is going to be moving in the wrong direction day by day.
It's very, from my own personal opinion, I like hearing the fact that you perceive it as wrong to divide people along those lines for political success. You know, we should be working together.
No, that strategy works. That strategy works for the sake of winning the elections. You remember George W. Bush won 2 terms, not just one, but 2 terms by employing the strategy to divide and conquer, right? Employed by his chief strategist, Mr. Karl Rove, right? Guns, God, gays, right? So he highlighted the differences and divides in American society and won 2 presidential elections. But what happened to the United States in general? What happened to the social fabric of American society? So we have to take a distinction between what is good for winning the elections and protecting particular leadership on one hand, and what is good for the presence and the future of the society as a whole.
Absolutely, and sometimes more centrist or unified positions, they don't have as much reach in society. They're not as emotive. They don't get across.
But the good news is that the American citizens came to a sense and elected untested, inexperienced young politician in Barack Obama, and as a first African American non-white president. So there is a lot of hope in South Korean politics. It's going to be one of my key topics today, that just like the United States politics, South Korean politics is very contentious and divisive. Yes, I admit that. But hey, politics is supposed to be very noisy, contentious, violent. But those are, aspects of politics being alive, politics being vibrant, and at the same time productive, being able to make necessary adjustments if necessary. So if you had George W. Bush administration for 8 years, you can also hope for having, different leadership for, 2 terms. It's like oscillation, moving not in a linear way, but steadily in the best possible, right course as you can have in the reality. So I think the impeachment of Park Geun-hye was very violent and shocking, but at the same time extremely necessary and helpful for the long-term maturation of South Korean politics. And we had the Moon Jae-in government afterwards as a response, collective response and choice of the presidency of Park Geun-hye. Now we have President-elect Yoon Seok-yeol as a public's reactions to the past 5 years of Moon Jae-in government. So it's an oscillation, which is very hard to stomach for many of us living in South Korea. But at the same time, it's a good sign, I believe, that you have to turn every stone and actually watch every dirty things underneath, like worms, but without admitting that you actually have worms underneath the stone. By having the courage to turn them, you cannot have change, meaningful change.
And that is the nature of democracy, yes, because if you don't have democracy, if you don't have this oscillation between the two systems, then you're left with stagnation. And we've seen in other nations what that can look like. Professor Bong, just getting back to this, the recent election, you spoke about the narrowest margin of Yoon Seok-yeol's victory and how this was carried by votes in Seoul, predominantly this 300,000 gap. If I ask you, do you think the Conservative Party won this election, or did the Democratic Party lose this election? Do you see any value in that question? Because 2 years ago, the Democratic Party in Korea, they swept the National Assembly, took a majority, and there were many articles and op-eds coming out that said Korean conservatism was dead and it would take years, decades, if not more, to reboot. And yet 2 years later, here they are. So was this a conservative victory or was it a Democratic Party defeat?
I like to say that it's an election lost by the Democrat Party, the ruling party, for two reasons. One, the Democrat Party actually had already handed over the outcome of the presidential election in 2021 when President Moon Jae-in insisted upon the appointment of Professor Cho Kuk to lead the Ministry of Justice. That controversial decision actually undercut the credibility and image of Moon Jae-in government and the ruling party, Democratic Party, even many years prior to the beginning of presidential election campaign last year. Because many of the constituents were greatly disappointed by the failure of the Moon Jae-in leadership to stand by what he had promised when it got elected after the impeachment of Park Geun-hye. So people began to question the credibility of the leadership as well as the ruling party in leading the nation in the direction of fairness and justice. And because of the controversial, prosecution of Professor Cho Kuk and his wife for forging public records to put their daughter in the university and medical school, prosecutor who was in charge of this prosecution of Mr. and Mrs. Cho became national hero, at least among the constituents critical of the ruling party and President Moon Jae-in. That turned out to be the president-elect Yoon Seok-yeol. Had it not been for this Cho Kuk scandal, there would not have become Yoon Seok-yeol as a national hero or representative of fairness and justice by law. Then extend your imagination. Without the appointment of Cho Kuk to be the Ministry of Justice, which he only served 1 month, 1 month, it's not worth it. It's not worth the loss of popularity. But it happened. And so Yoon Seok-yeol suddenly became the most trusted person in South Korea to lead the nation in the direction of common sense, fairness, and justice. Without that, there would not have been a political candidate called Yoon Seok-yeol. So it is likely that the opposition party, which won this election, the PPP, People's Power Party, would have elected one of its core members as a candidate in the presidential election. I would say Mr. Hong Jun-pyo, who actually had run already, representing the party in the previous election, presidential election after the impeachment of Park Geun-hye. Then the presidential candidate from the ruling party, Democratic Party, might not have been former Governor Lee Jae-myung, the real candidate, but somebody else, say the former Prime Minister and former President of the party, Lee Nak-yeon, I would say. But it doesn't really matter either whether it would have been Lee Jae-myung or Lee Nak-yeon representing the ruling party. And there would not have been a very strong critical opinions of the Moon Jae-in presidency and the ruling party for hypocrisy and double standard. And now you are facing Mr. Hong Jun-pyo and somebody from within the PPP in the presidential election. Then Democratic Party would have easily won the presidential election. It's all 2020 hindsight. That's one of the two reasons why I said that it was an election lost by the Democratic Party, not really won by the PPP. And the second thing is that I'm hesitant to call this electoral victory won by PPP because it is not a victory by genuine conservatives in Korean politics, right? The outcomes of the election is mainly indicative of public anger toward the progressive, or at least the so-called the 586 generation, the former student activist generation, standing by the principles and values they used to sacrifice themselves to protect. So we do not really have many genuine conservatives inside the PPP. Okay.
I've often
So they are the recipients of the criticism and disappointment toward the other side. So for these two reasons, I would like to call this election as an election lost by the ruling Progressive Party, not an election won by the Korean conservatives, because there are not many politicians who deserve the label as a genuine conservatives standing by conservative values in Korean politics. Windfall victory.
Sure. I get that, Professor Bong, and maybe Yoon's victory doesn't signify that the nation has suddenly become more conservative, but rather it was an anti-vote. It was anger at the current administration. I just want to touch on this element. So you mentioned the first reason was Yoon's prosecution or investigation into the former Justice Minister, Mr. Cho Kuk. But Yoon Seok-yeol was also behind the investigations into former President Park Geun-hye and Lee Myung-bak. Is that correct? So he's gone after the most powerful people on both sides of the political divide. This is quite hard to understand or get my brain wrapped around sometimes, because if it was just attacking one side, it would make more sense. It's easier to comprehend. But Yoon Seok-yeol has been behind the investigations into Cho Kuk for the Democratic Party, and then into two ex-presidents, and now he is the president. What do you make of that? Do you have any insight into that, Professor Bong, how he's gone both ways?
Yes, I'd like to reiterate the first remark I made, that we have to be really careful in engaging our own analytical thinking about the aphorism that people do not change. Right? If you're a prosecutor, then you're supposed to be acting as a prosecutor. And Yoon Seok-yeol is a prosecutor. He was not supposed to be acting like a politician or a journalist or politician or even academic, right? That is why, as a prosecutor, he was going after crimes, which he was assigned to investigate and prosecute. So there's no distinction to be made by Mr. Yoon Seok-yeol as a prosecutor in charge, whether it was a conservative president in Park Geun-hye and Lee Myung-bak, or the superstar representing the progressive faction in South Korean politics in Professor Cho Kuk. Crimes are crimes, cases are cases. But if you succumb yourself to political logics or factionalism, then you no longer act as a pure prosecutor, but politicized, political prosecutor motivated by exterior motives. So I don't think it should be puzzling to any observers of Yoon Seok-yeol's track record for the past 10 years, and he becoming the next president of South Korea. I see continuation, not zigzag or flip-flop.
That's very interesting, because if you see him as a politician, it doesn't make sense. If you see him as a prosecutor or someone trying to uphold the law, it makes perfect sense, because nobody is above the law. Thank you.
Adding to my previous comment that if it were other candidates coming from PPP, then the PPP would have lost the election, because constituents would have easily recognized that the candidates did not represent true conservative values in Korea. Hong Jun-pyo did not acknowledge that the impeachment of Park Geun-hye was lawful and right. Right? But Yoon Seok-yeol prosecuted both President Park Geun-hye and Lee Myung-bak. So he didn't carry the baggage of being a part of the so false or shallow, superficial conservatism in Korean politics.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I just want to look now, if I can, Professor Bong, at some of these elements that perhaps, so the fairness and the justice that Yoon Seok-yeol, president-elect, brings. Some people point to regionalism. They'd look at the votes almost reaching 9-1. They'd look at the age. Some would look at the gender. You mentioned Seoul. Some people have pointed to the house prices as determining votes. Do they all have equal weight? Are any of these more interesting in unpacking Yoon's victory? Do you think regionalism is dead? Does economic class determine how you vote? How do you unpack some of those factors, Professor Bong?
Well, I'd like to highlight a few most important determinants in terms of deciding the election outcome. One is, of course, the public anger, especially in the metropolitan area, concentrated in the capital city Seoul and some of the Gyeonggi province, about the failed policies to curb the rise of housing prices for the past 5 years under the Moon Jae-in government. As I said, that it is a very rare phenomenon that the Conservative Party presidential candidate actually won more votes in Seoul. And the only explanation is public anger about failed real estate policy in that area. Second, most important variable in determining the outcome of the election, this time in favor of the loser, Governor Lee Jae-myung of the Democratic Party, is the women voters who were feared at such a harsh, wrong-headed campaign platform by the PPP and the candidate Mr. Yoon Seok-yeol. But it was not enough to actually, change the entire outcome of the presidential election. But it really made the election so close.
Yeah.
And the third variable to be considered is the decision by Dr. Ahn Chul-soo to join Mr. Yoon Seok-yeol and produce a unified candidate in Mr. Yoon Seok-yeol. I think the decision by Dr. Ahn Chul-soo was at a minimum non-factor in terms of elevating the popularity of conservative candidate Yoon Seok-yeol. At a maximum, or at worst, it mobilized a lot of votes that would have been gone to the different candidates to go to Mr. Lee Jae-myung, which made the election so close. So voters who were inclined to cast their ballots to candidates like Dr. Ahn Chul-soo or Madam Sang-jung were so angry at this back deal, unification of candidates by Yoon Seok-yeol and Dr. Ahn Chul-soo. So they decided to vote for Lee Jae-myung instead. What does it imply to the immediate future of the presidency of Yoon Seok-yeol this year and next year? Ahn Chul-soo is going to be the head of the preparatory committee. And it is very likely for him to be the first prime minister appointed by the new president Yoon Seok-yeol. But that doesn't necessarily mean a bright future lying ahead for Dr. Ahn Chul-soo. I think two renowned politicians are going to be forgotten sooner or later in Korean politics after this presidential election. One is Dr. Ahn Chul-soo. Because the election result clearly show that Dr. Ahn Chul-soo, as a brand name or as a political leader, doesn't count much. He doesn't really rule substantial number of votes, right? I mean, him joining Mr. Yoon Seok-yeol almost backfired.
Right.
But he's useful. He's useful for now, in the short term, for the presidency of Yoon Seok-yeol, in terms of maintaining the image of unified, open leadership across different ideologies, across different sectors in the society, by promoting the status of Ahn Chul-soo for a while. And you know that the National Assembly is dominated by the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
So any attempts by the Yoon Seok-yeol government to change the government structure, to produce new policies to alleviate the pains and difficulties for small business people during the COVID-19 pandemics, any revolutionary measures, electoral reforms, you name it, would be likely shut down by the majority members in the National Assembly who are the Democratic Party. If there will be a stalemate and a series of failures in the first few months of Yoon Seok-yeol presidency this year, then President Yoon Seok-yeol can easily shift the blame and responsibility to the Prime Minister, Ahn Chul-soo, not himself. And by promoting the political stature and influence of Ahn Chul-soo inside the party, will undercut the influence and position of the current party chairperson, Lee Jun-seok, whose election strategy turned out to be a miserable failure. So it's like a Chinese traditional strategy, 一-一. You pit one enemy against another enemy. You pit one barbarian against another barbarian and secure your supremacy as a Chinese civilization. So Ahn Chul-soo is useful in terms of protecting himself as a new president and controlling and checking the influence of party chairman Lee Jun-seok, who, by the way, had actually briefly betrayed Mr. Yoon Seok-yeol at the election process. But after those process will be done and after dust will be settled, I think these two politicians will be clearly demonstrated in the bare eyes of politicians and the public as their utilities and appeal as political leaders have been expired. So they will be forced to be retired as an influential political leaders. That's my prediction.
It's what makes it more complicated. We talk about Yoon Seok-yeol going across lines. Ahn Chul-soo has also done that in the past, hasn't he? He sided with the Democratic Party, I think.
No. Yoon Seok-yeol never crossed the party line. He never had party line. He never had the party line. That is why he was abandoned and attacked by Moon Jae-in presidency and the ruling party, because he refused to vow his allegiance to the Democratic Party. And he did not have a party line in favor of the conservative in politics, because he put two conservative presidents in jail.
Yeah. No, you absolutely.
He never had a party line to cross, different from Ahn Chul-soo.
Right. Perhaps my language was not on point there. Whereas
by the way, Dr. Ahn Chul-soo did not have a party line either. No. He had to cross because he had party lines, plural, his own party lines, right, for the past 10 years. And he almost always abandoned his own party lines. So he never crossed the party lines, but he just jettisoned the party lines he created.
And he nearly, it's interesting because I would have assumed that perhaps his support or unification with Yoon Seok-yeol, combining those positions, would have been enough to take him across the line. But you're saying that nearly lost, and Ahn Chul-soo's votes went to perhaps Lee Jae-myung candidate. That's a very interesting analysis. We should probably just very briefly touch on Madam Sang-jung. In 2017, she recorded about 2 million votes, 6%, in a five-way race. This time she was down to about 800,000, only getting 2%. And that's in a time where, gender was a big part of the conversation, and she was the one representing women's rights, LGBT rights, and speaking for the oppressed. Why did she do so poorly, Professor Bong, or did she not? How do we analyze her performance and her results here?
Well, the overriding interpretation of the poor performance of Sang-jung in this election at approximately 2% of votes is that at the last days of the presidential election campaign, voters who were not really decided between the two major candidates, but later so angered and anxious about the positions hostile to Korean women, and the voters who got so angered at the backroom deal between Dr. Ahn Chul-soo and Mr. Yoon Seok-yeol decided to cast their ballots away from Sang-jung, although they are all sympathetic with and supported for the principles, values, and programs Sang-jung advocated. They decided to vote for Mr. Lee Jae-myung of Democratic Party for the sake of not granting the election to Mr. Yoon Seok-yeol. It is a negative voting behavior for the purpose of avoiding the worst case scenario. But I think that is only partially true. I don't deny that that explanation is plausible and mostly correct. But what I'm saying is that that explanation cannot explain the whole story, because Sang-jung's popularity rate prior to the candidacy unification between Yoon and Ahn, and prior to the last week of the presidential election campaign, the average rate was even lower than 2% she actually got as a final result of the election. Right? So her popularity and her appeal was already, regardless of all these things, already so low. I think it's voters who have been very sympathetic with the platforms and activities of Justice Party were disappointed by the leadership of Sang-jung as a key representative of the party. They did not speak up when there was a Cho Kuk scandal. The name of the party is Justice Party, right? And if Justice Party failed to take very strong, clear stance on a case that is so central to the issue of justice and fairness, then what's the point? What is the mandate of the party? You may have a very low bar of expectation when it comes to fairness and justice for, say, PPP, right? Low expectation would lead to almost no disappointment. But the supporters of Justice Party had a very high expectation for the party to stand up for justice, and the party miserably failed in a critical moment. And the Justice Party sided with the ruling Democrat Party when there was a election reform. So the party had to pay the price for the sins it had committed even before the beginning of presidential election. And Sang-jung, being the same presidential candidate for many presidential elections, did not help the cause. the Justice Party should have had a different candidate, younger, fresher, new face to represent the party, representing the different future of Korean society based upon fairness, justice, and humanity. But Sang-jung is too familiar to voters, even those who support have traditionally supported the Justice Party.
I've made similar comments about the Justice Party in that Shim was the oldest candidate, and I thought perhaps there was room for them to put forward a younger candidate that could speak for the generations of the 20s and 30s, even if they weren't going to win, but provide the experience. In that sense, Professor Bong, do you think there is room for youth in Korean politics? I know the voting age has gone down to 18 in elections, and there have been various laws for members of National Assembly now and political parties. But when we see the Progressive Party, for example, with the oldest candidate, is there room to be like other countries like New Zealand or Finland, Estonia, and have young women take prominent roles in Korean politics?
Well, that change cannot be made outside the general trends in Korean society and politics, right? Yes. These two things tend to go together. So we have to have a general improvement of gender equality and the advancement of youth in daily aspects of Korean society, whether it's a workplace or in politics or in industry. Having said that, I think we have a bright future because it is clearly demonstrated that the voice of the young generations in politics indeed matter and matter a lot. Two by-elections, mayoral elections in Seoul and Busan, clearly show that angry young voters never hesitated to express their anger and choices. And in this presidential election, the younger voters, especially young female voters, made it really clear that they would not just sit still and play victims anymore. They will do whatever it takes to make their voice listened. So we may remain quite frustrated if we only measure the advancement of the young generation in politics in terms of specific individuals assuming specific positions in the government or in the parliament or in the in the court. But if we apply more aggregate perspective on the same issue, then I think the future is very optimistic and bright because we have cases demonstrating that young generations are not indifferent to politics. They are not indifferent. They consider politics very important matter to them as a group, as a generation, but at the same time as individuals. And second, as an extension of this belief, they acted.
Yeah.
You know, there's a line in the one of my favorite movie, director Christopher Nolan's movie, Batman Begins, the first one of the trilogy. Did you watch the movie?
I have seen it, yeah.
Yeah. You know, there's a scene in which the Bruce Wayne, he pretend to be a billionaire playboy to hide his true identity as a champion of justice in the city of Gotham. So in one scene that he played with the supermodels in the fountain inside the hotel.
I remember.
And on his way out to the limousine with the models, ouch, he met his love interest, prosecutor, Rachel Dodd, right? And he was so embarrassed. He wanted to explain to her that he's not a playboy, he's faking, right? But Bruce Wayne could not really reveal that he is Batman. So Bruce Wayne murmured that Rachel, this is not me. I'm more. I'm more underneath. And the prosecutor and the girlfriend, Rachel, said to Bruce Wayne that, Bruce, deep down, you may still be the great kid you used to be. But it is not who you are underneath, but what you do that defines you. But young generation in Korea do not just remain idle or indifferent to politics. They act. And it was demonstrated in the previous series of important elections.
Yeah. I love that positivity, I must say, Professor Bong. Do you think it also extends, and you're right, I think, to highlight the youth's, there's not apathy here. They are voting, and the broader turnout, it didn't quite reach 80%, as some people predicted, but it was 77, just over 77%.
71%.
Yeah. 71%. Democracy in Korea seems really good. There's this kind of automatic registration, polling places are there, there's a national holiday. I sometimes feel in other countries that there are efforts made to prevent people from voting or make it harder. It might be to secure validity of votes and things like that, I understand, but Korea's democracy seems really awesome to me. Just from my perspective, what's your take on it? Are you pleased with the turnout and the way the actual whole process of going to the polls and voting is carried out?
Well, 71 out of 100 ain't bad. I would say that, although it's a designated national holiday, because the strong desire to cast ballot was already demonstrated in the early voting days for 2 days, Friday and Saturday. Which were not, free days for most of the voters who actually went out to the voting booth. So there's an element of personal determination and sacrifice I would like to highlight, despite the fact that election days are designated to be a national holiday to allow as many voters as possible to actually exercise their political rights. And 71% is a very high rate, and I welcome the fact that the election campaigns were extremely contentious, because I believe in the benefits of hitting the bottom. I'm not saying that I'm a recovering alcoholic, but based upon my drugstore, very shallow knowledge of psychology, then in order for any average person to start meaningful inroad to full recovery from addiction, you have to first admit that you are in trouble. You have to admit that you have serious issue. And you have to hit the bottom before you use that bottom as a solid foundation to move up, to have a different type of life. So you have to be ready to expose yourself to all these vials, dirty things in politics. You cannot hide from them. You cannot deny their existence, but you have to admit that they are you. You allow these dirty, corrupt, inept politicians to have reached where they are. Without your indifference, without your calculation of selfish interest, they would not have been able to have gained so much. So you permitted them. You permitted them to reach that status, to have that much influence. So you have to see the consequences of what you did in the past. So you cannot say that, oh, politics is so dirty. I'm not like politicians. No, they are at least part of you, and you are part of them. So in that regard, being exposed to all this, bad things that you found some difficult to deal with in front of TV screen or on the media. This is good for your own education. This is good for your change, preparation to change. Otherwise, you have to admit that you have serious problem and you are at least partly responsible for. Then there will be very good, essential beginning of necessary change.
That's the first answer that I've ever heard that's tried to take a positive approach to this, the various mudslinging that we've seen. I think it was Ralph Waldo Emerson that said that the government that you have is a reflection of the soul of society. So
yes.
That's the idea that I'm taking from you there.
You put the same thing in a far better way.
It's the same idea. I know you're pushed for time. Let me give 3 more questions, if I may, Professor Bong. In the next 5 years, do you imagine much change in the daily life of people? I know foreign policy is a big thing and all of this, but for your average working Chul-soo or Geun-hye or somebody like that, do you see much change in the next 5 years in daily life?
Yes, I do. I do believe that there will be substantial changes in a very important ways to all citizens in Korean society. Why? Because there has been a pattern. Even during the Lee Myung-bak administration, even during the Park Geun-hye administration, which has not even finished the designated term of service, and even for the past 5 years, the politics have been beneficial to every citizen in South Korean society. Many listeners will say that what is it talking about, right? We suffer so much. But it depends on your perspective. As I said, that knowing who you are, knowing exactly about the system you're living in, and knowing exactly what you have to do if you want to change the system in certain ways, what kind of sacrifice you have to be ready to make. They are all beneficial. They are all beneficial. When we were neglectful, 300 kids died in Seoul ferry incident. But now we remember the individual and collective trauma we went through with the family members of the victims. And we took actions in the street and in many other venues to make changes. Not always successful, but there were important cases of people taking action and making choices out of the comfort zone. It has been pattern in South Korean politics with every presidency in the past. So if the past is the best indicator of the future, then I would say that, yes, Professor, in the next 5 years, there will be a lot of substantial and important changes that will affect every nook and cranny of every citizen in Korean society, because it has been a pattern. And I don't see any good, strong reason why South Korean policy will get out of this pattern.
History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, perhaps. So we will see these continuous changes. When you talk about patterns and history, the second question I have for you, Professor Bong, is how would you then evaluate President Moon's 5-year tenure? Because when we look at his support rating, relatively it's very high. Korea has that lame duck presidency. Many leave with very low ratings. His rating's still quite high, and yet it won't be his party continuing for the next 5 years. Do you have any observations the last 5 years of President Moon's administration and what kind of legacy he might leave?
Well, I guess the evaluation of the legacy and performance of the presidency of Moon Jae-in have been already made very clearly in the election outcomes. Yoon Seok-yeol won the election, but very thin margin. I think that is a very clear summary of the public perception and assessment of the past 5 years.
Yeah.
In the context of the Democratic Party's election strategy, they must be quite regretful that they did not enough in terms of trying to get the hearts and minds of the voters critical of the Moon Jae-in government's legacy. Because it seems like the campaigners in the Democratic Party were so afraid of trying aggressive to capture those voters because of the continuously high approval rating of President Moon Jae-in, right? 40% and above.
Yeah.
But they should have seen the discrepancy between people's orientation toward president and people's orientation toward what happened for the past 4 to 5 years under the president. So, example, the Democratic Party should have used is the very high approval rating of President Barack Obama and the outcome of the following presidential election in which Mr. Donald Trump of the Republican Party won, not Senator and former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton winning the election, representing the Democratic Party that Barack Obama belonged to. Barack Obama's approval rating in the final week of his presidency in the White House was, I believe, 57%. So he was fondly remembered by the voters participating in the ongoing presidential election, but majority of them actually voted not for the candidate from the same party as President Barack Obama, but the opposition party candidate, Donald Trump. So you can have both. You can have both. Positive feelings toward the current leadership. At the same time, you might have also, at the same time, very strong desire to see something different, something new.
Yeah. That's interesting. I haven't quite wrapped my brain around that one, but I like it.
Voters do not want one or two things. Voters want many things, and many things may collide with each other.
Sometimes we're not rational actors, are we? We've got all these conflicting desires and interests and emotions.
We are human, and I like it.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
My last question for you today, Professor Bong, and I'm very grateful for your time. This is a question that I ask everyone. It might come a little bit out of nowhere, but I would like to also offer it to you because I've enjoyed hearing your analysis of politics, human nature, and Batman. The question is, Professor Bong, that we're all in this world together. What can we do to make our lives and the lives of others more meaningful? What should we be working towards? What, Professor Bong, is the meaning of life?
Well, since you mentioned my Batman analogy, a good one, that I like to repeat it, right? If it works, why don't I use it once again? That you have to be a person of action. If you do not take an action, then you cannot be part of change. And there may not be a change to your liking that you need. So I think it's tied to human nature and reality in this world. And if you want something, then you have to raise your voice. You have to take an action. There is no guarantee that your action will pay off. But without action, then there will not be change. There's a saying that you can be a kind of person only up to what you have ever imagined. You cannot be a greater person than the realm of your imaginations and hopes. So you have to have a very high bar of expectation about yourself deserving very good political life as a citizens of a liberal democracy in South Korea. But if you do not act, that means that you do not exercise your basic rights and leave others dictate your own rights and life. If it's okay with you, go ahead, but do not complain about the result. But if you want something, then you have to participate in politics in some ways. And I'm happy that 71% of all eligible voters participated in the election, despite the fact that we happen to have most unfavorable candidates in Mr. Yoon Seok-yeol and Mr. Jae-myung. Not casting vote would have been an easier choice, but people, despite this depressive situation, they came up and bothered to vote. So
I like it. I like the idea, Professor Bong, that you are the limits of your imagination are important. Right? So action is there. I believe it was Jean-Paul Sartre that said, "You are the result of everything that you have thought up until this point." And so you have to think things, and then, as you say, act them out and do it. It's been great. Thank you very much for your time today, sir.
You're welcome, and thank you very much for allowing me to join this wonderful program.